Well, you know, since I've suddenly added the word version to a diagram, you know it's that time. We're going to talk about the versions of Hsrp, two of them, and we know for the real world, and frankly, maybe a little especially for the exam, we've got to know similarities and differences between the two versions, as well as answering that musical question, do they work well together? Because sometimes versions 1 and 2 of a feature or a protocol or anything on a Cisco device will work together nicely, and sometimes they won't. So we're going to see that live here in just a moment. We are using the gig Ethernet interface on router 1 instead of the fast Ethernet, but router 2 right now is the active for group 5 version 1 at 10.1.1.2, and router 1 is the standby. We'll go ahead and verify that right here, along with something highlighted that you have seen over and over and over again. And I know you noticed it by then, that it said V1 default after local virtual MAC address. So we know if there is a V1 default, there must be a V2 default. Otherwise, everything's just perfectly fine right now, but for reasons we will discuss later in this video, we just want to move to version 2. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll standby 5. And of course, being on the interface would be a great help. And we've got some options here that we are definitely used to seeing, and there's one that we don't see, and that's version. It's not mentioning anything about a version here. Well, let me show you where you're actually going to find some other Hsrp commands for future consideration. And they're right here with standby. And we see the usual 255 groups, and we see some things under here we haven't discussed, and we also see enable Hsrp IPv6. That's interesting. And at the very bottom, we see version. Now, we will get into some of these options in other courses. We're not going to get into them today because we want to stick with the fundamentals. And most of the time, 99% of the time perhaps, everything you need to do for Hsrp is with the standby group number command, and then you can use iOS help to see what your options are. We have some stuff in here we'll get into in your CCNP studies and your security studies, but right now we need to stick with the version, so let's see what our options are there. Pardon me, 1 and 2, no surprises there. And if you've ever tripped over this where you're looking for the version, join the club, because I get plenty of messages on it, social media, email, otherwise, where it's like, hey, wait a minute, I'm trying to change my Hsrp version. Apparently I have an iOS that doesn't support that. Almost every iOS does. I'm not going to say everyone does, but most of them do. You just got to look in standby version instead of putting your group number in there, because when we're changing versions, it is not a per group operation. It's not a per interface operation. It's a per router operation. If we're changing this to version 2, which we're going to do right now, then you're changing it for the entire router and all of your groups. Now, group 5 just went to state standby to init, and we know what that's all about, but we also know that changing the version caused that, because when we see a console message and we just change something, what caused the console message? The thing we just did. I know a lot, and I know how silly that sounds to have to say out loud, but some people are just in denial. I didn't do that. Yes, you did. We did this. And let's go ahead and run show standby. Let's see what else is going on. And you can see state is standby, but it just went to active, and now we're getting another message. And we know whenever we see the duplicate address message that it's going to keep coming until we fix it. But let's go ahead and look at show standby while we're here right now. We've got a lot of state changes because I flipped a couple things around when we were changing interfaces. But we've got 19 state changes, nothing to be alarmed at there. What we are looking at all of a sudden is we have version 2 mentioned. Notice that it did not mention version 1 when we were running version 1. So unless you're told version 2 here or in a question on an exam or job interview or what have you, assume version 1. So also notice version 2 default is being used to the MAC address, and notice the format is different. I know we got a couple highlights there, I apologize, but the address is definitely different. We're coming back to that. But let's run show standby now, and you can see active router is local. Okay. So let's just say someone was doing this, lab work, production work, doesn't matter, and calls you and says, hey, wait, I got the weirdest thing right now. I got multiple active routers in my group. And technically, I guess he's right, because group 5 active router is local. And then we go over to router 2 and run show standby. And we see group 5 active router is local. Now, that'll freak you out if you don't realize that you're running different versions. You will because you took this course, and on top of that, there will be no need for you to freak out. So we've got the duplicate address message. We expect that because what's going on right now is that in essence, we have two separate Hsrp groups. We have Group 5 version 1 and Group 5 version 2, and they're both in the role of active, both routers 1 and 2. And this is really the only way you're ever going to see multiple active routers in an Hsrp group. So if you see that, you don't even need to look at the configs. Just say, look at your versions, because your versions are probably a mismatch, and that is never going to work well between versions 1 and 2 of Hsrp. So let's go ahead and fix that, and we'll go on the fast Ethernet interface and do standby version 2. So router 2 is going from active to init because we changed the version. We didn't change the group number, but we changed the version. And we'll hang out here for a minute to see what the change is. And you can see version 2 mentioned already at the top. It's in speak state, so we should be close to going either active or standby. There's that virtual MAC address, preemption disabled, speak to standby, and that's going to be it, I believe, because you can see preemption is still disabled. That's another default of both versions. Preemption is disabled. So router 2 came up, started talking around, looking around, and said, hey, wait a minute, Group 5 version 2 already has an active router, so I can only take over as standby, and that's exactly what router 2 did. So we've got a couple of changes here, and I've got all these changes for you on the board. I'll show you in a moment because you can't see them all here. But again, the virtual MAC address definitely changed. We can see that part changed right there. Now we have like a 005. Maybe all three of those values are reserved for our group. But there's our version 2 default. Version 2 is mentioned up here. But you can see some things didn't change. The virtual IP address, we configure that. The hello and hold times are the same at 3 and 10 seconds for the defaults. And that's about it. Let's go ahead and run show standby one more time just so we can see active routers 10111. Shows you what the MAC address is, and then the priority, and that's the physical interface, of course. This is the virtual MAC address that we're seeing up here. Let me show you the difference. Now we're seeing the MAC address of the physical MAC address of the physical router, and the MAC address we're paying attention to up here most of the time is the one for the virtual router. So again, that's changed. We'll have a look at that in a moment. One more change that I do want to show you before we head back to the whiteboard for a few minutes. Notice the group number change. That's the big change right there, or a big change. Instead of 0 through 255, we now have 0 through 4095. So it's a lot more groups when it comes to Hsrp version 2. The big differences, we saw that one just now. Version 2 offers 4095 groups. Version 1, 0 through 255, so technically it's one or two more, but you could see the huge range of them. Version 2 supports IP version 6, version 1 doesn't. That's the big change right there. That's what you're going to have to look at when you're running Hsrp for IP version 6. Now, I want to draw a line here for you, though, between RIP and Hsrp as far as the versions go. With RIP version 1, we know it broadcasts, where RIP version 2 multicast to 224.0.0.9. Both versions of Hsrp multicast, but they do use different addresses. Version 1 uses 224.0.0.2. Version 2 multicast to 224.0.0.102. So it's got both version numbers in there if that helps you remember it. Now the MAC addresses, we saw the format is different, but also the reserved number of values, or X's if you will, is different. It has to be because with Hsrp version 2, you're looking at group ranging from numbering from 0 to 4095. So we had to have an extra bit in there, and you can see we're looking at 0000, 0C9F, FXXX, where XXX is the group number in hex. With version 1, we know it's 00000C07 AC, and then the last two values are the group number in hex. So that is another big difference we've got to watch out for. But the biggest changes beyond the MAC addresses, and I would know both of those by sight really, with your Hsrp version differences is that version 2 supports IP version 6, version 1 doesn't, and version 2 gives you a lot more groups. You should know the multicast addresses as well. I think that's a good idea. But we've also seen now that the versions do not play well together at all. And you also know how to spot it. I'll just run show standby one more time. Ever since I moved the keyboard, I keep misspelling it. That's my story anyway. And we can see everything else, the output of show standby really looks the same. Just look for your versions and you'll know exactly what's going on. We're about ready to move on from Hsrp, but first I want to bring you a lab that I've never seen, because we do see, just about everything in the Cisco PDFs off the site and everything else, Hsrp groups are always 2 routers. And certainly nothing wrong with that, but what happens if you have a 3rd router involved? We're going to find out in the very next video. See you there.